Hello, welcome to another show of New Hampshire Citizens for Progress. Good to see you. Let me get this mask off. My glasses are steaming. That virus is still out there, and we were doing real good. The numbers were coming down, the amount of people dying and getting sick. But people started relaxing. Things are opening. You still have to take a course of action that keeps you and your family and people you deal with safe. So that's an easy item to do, not a big deal. Please take care of your neighbors. So today's show, I'm going to be talking with Don Kreis. He's our ratepayer advocate for the citizens of New Hampshire. And there's a bunch of stuff happening. Last week we did a show on no coal, no gas was doing a utility strike. We're going to discuss that and other things taking place in the energy market here in New Hampshire. So, good afternoon, Don. How are we doing?
Good afternoon, Rick. It is such a pleasure to be on your excellent program for my second visit. This is actually my first trip to Manchester since the beginning of the pandemic, so I've been very good about being careful about where I go and who I breathe on during the pandemic, and I'm glad to see that you're taking it very seriously as well.
Your basic belief in our energy program is efficiency. Don't use the power to begin with. Save what energy we can have, and that's one of the most effective ways that you can spend your money to prevent having to use electricity.
Yes, and it is a very timely topic for us to talk about because here in New Hampshire, we rely on our electric and natural gas utilities to deliver energy efficiency programs to customers, and the utilities have just filed their new, it's called a triennial plan because it is the plan for how we're going to do this in 2021, 2022, and 2023. And I'm very pleased to be able to say that the utilities listened to us, meaning me and other fervent advocates of energy efficiency, and adopted some pretty ambitious goals for how much energy we're going to save. Because as I know you know, and as I'm guessing almost everybody who watches this show knows, a negawatt is cheaper than a megawatt. It is the cheapest and most environmentally benign way of serving the next kilowatt hour or therm of demand for energy.
In regards to no coal, no gas, this utility strike, I had them on last week, and I myself have a concern about it because basically there's 26,000 people in New Hampshire approximately losing the ability to pay for rent, utilities, or have health care at this point. This pandemic has caused, we don't have our restaurant, not everybody's open 100%. And it's slowly changing.
Yeah, indeed. So I do have a lot of respect for the climate activism and sense of concern and outrage that drives the folks who are organizing the utility ratepayer strike. I just happen not to agree with that particular tactic. I participated in an effort over the last few weeks to negotiate an agreement about how we are going to handle utility disconnections during the remainder of the pandemic, given that the governor, so when the pandemic started, one of the first things the governor did was put out an executive order saying no disconnections. But then the utilities convinced him to rescind that order, so it's no longer part of the governor's exercise of emergency powers. Now it's up to the Public Utilities Commission, and the PUC has rules about disconnections. Those rules are going to be, I think, slightly tweaked in a way that is helpful in making sure that those 26,000 people that you just mentioned are not unreasonably deprived of their utility service. So we're working pretty hard to make sure that people who are stressed and can't afford to pay for their electricity or natural gas or water right now aren't left out in the cold and the dark as the fall turns into winter. And it just isn't helpful to have a grassroots group going around the region and saying, well, even if you can afford to pay your utility bill, you just shouldn't pay as a form of protest. I don't think that's a constructive way of drawing attention to the need to do something about climate change.
Yeah, and that's almost a result in itself of the pandemic, though, because, I mean, normally you would go to places, even the elections, you would knock on doors, you would talk to people, you would have meetings, and this pandemic has made it next to impossible to do that sort of organizing, to maintain that activity and interest in this topic.
Well, I'm not a political organizer for sure, but I spend a lot of time on my computer these days, and in some ways, the pandemic is driving me crazy. It really has affected my quality of life and everybody else's in a profoundly negative way. But I do think that in some ways it's easier to connect with people because the norm is now, you fire up Zoom or whatever program you use, FaceTime, and you can have essentially a face-to-face conversation with somebody even if they're 2 time zones away from you, or 3.
So we have this contract coming up, and this is where the utilities provide funds for these efficiency programs to exist?
Actually, I don't agree with that. It's not the utilities that provide anything. Every last cent of this resource that we devote to energy efficiency come from one of 3 places. The vast majority of it comes right out of the pockets of ratepayers. On your electric bill, there's a thing called the system benefits charge. Much of that charge goes to pay for these programs. We take that money, we combine it with money that comes in through the regional capacity market, because energy efficiency bids into the wholesale market for electricity capacity. And then there's some money that comes from the regional greenhouse gas initiative. And those 3 sources are what pay for the energy efficiency programs. The utilities have no skin in the game as far as I'm concerned. In fact, they get made whole because they receive compensation for the revenue they lose for this, and we pay them a shareholder incentive. So their shareholders are given extra money if the companies make sufficient progress on energy efficiency. So it's ratepayers, not the utilities, as far as I'm concerned. That said, I don't want to trash the utilities because they deliver these programs, and I would say in general they do a pretty good job. So what the utility ratepayer strike people are saying is, we want to shut down Merrimack Station. Merrimack Station is the biggest legacy coal burner plant left in New England without a shutdown plan. It's about a 400 megawatt plant, and you can see it if you're driving up or down I-93, and those folks want to shut it down. I am convinced that their utility ratepayer strike, there isn't enough of a causal connection between people not paying their electric bill or their natural gas bill and that plant getting shut down. And it hardly ever runs as it is. It's, one of the things that drives me crazy about our energy situation here in New Hampshire is that back when Public Service Company owned Merrimack Station, they wasted $425 million putting a big mercury scrubber on that plant instead of shutting it down. And now the ratepayers of the state, through their stranded cost charge on their Eversource bill, are paying off $400 million of that $425 million, and meanwhile the plant is sitting out there in Bow, hardly ever running. What that tells me is that back when PSNH owned the plant, which it did until early 2018, they should have just decided to shut it down and not double down on it by spending that extra pile of money. So coal, there are 2 coal plants in New Hampshire. There's Merrimack Station and then there's Schiller Station up in Portsmouth. And they are both creatures of the 1950s, and their days are numbered. I'm convinced of it. And we will soon get to the point in New England where we are not at all reliant on coal to produce our electricity. But we are very reliant on natural gas, and natural gas is also a fossil fuel, and it does produce carbon emissions. And it's better than coal, but it is a lot worse if you're worried about the climate than using wind or solar. The more distributed storage and generation we have, the more resilient and flexible and adaptable and environmentally sustainable the electricity grid becomes. It's really cool stuff.
Well, I'm going to look forward to bringing on Clifton Below into this conversation, and we'll be right back. We were discussing efficiency and energy programs in the state of New Hampshire, and one of the pieces of legislation that did pass last session was RSA 53, which is community power. And this gentleman wrote the bill. So can you give us some background on what this bill's hoping to accomplish?
Sure, this is Chapter 53E of the New Hampshire RSAs, and it was actually originally enacted way back in 1996, just a few months after the passage of New Hampshire's Electric Utility Industry Restructuring Act that made a major policy change. It said generation services, the supply of electricity, as opposed to its distribution through the monopoly wires, should be open to competition, and we should use competitive markets for electricity supply rather than regulated utilities. And states throughout New England, except Vermont, and in other parts of the country, changed their systems so that the development and operation of power plants became a competitive business. And ISO New England was formed, and there was development of a competitive wholesale market for electricity. And the notion of 53E that was passed at the time was to create municipal or county aggregations that could bring to small customers, like residential customers and small business customers, some of the choices and opportunities that would be available to large customers, most of whom have migrated to competitive electric supply. And but that law was written so you had to do it on an opt-in basis. You had to sign up each customer one at a time. And that has proven not to really be viable because it's difficult with small customers to get their attention and sign them up. So other states created this municipal and county aggregation option that allowed a democratic process, often called community choice aggregation, because it says a community, through their elected representatives, can choose to, in effect, become the default service supplier of electricity rather than utility. So in any case, other states, this has kind of really taken off in a few other states like California, where CCAs, community choice aggregations, have become very active in leading sort of a transformation of the electric grid so that your folks are developing local renewable resources. They're developing competitive demand response programs. They're helping to deploy electrification for vehicles, things like that. So following on that model, we proposed to change the law in New Hampshire to allow an opt-out provision, which says once the governing body and the legislative body, which would be in a town, the selectmen is the governing body and the town meeting is the legislative body, if they both approve a community power aggregation program, then the town, on an opt-out basis, then the town or county can become essentially the default service supplier. Customers who can choose to stick with the utility default service, or if they're already on competitive supply, they would stick with that. But if they didn't opt out of the community power aggregation, they would be moved over to it. But then even in the future, they could still choose to go back to the utility provided service or go with some competitor. So that was actually enacted last year in 2019. It became effective last October. And, almost a year out, we're still trying to work on getting the first ones launched. And part of that is because the PUC has to do some rules, some administrative rules, to manage how we interact with the investor-owned utilities. And it shouldn't be surprising that the utilities are proposing requirements in the rules that basically would make this impossible to do. I think they don't like the idea of there being competition for their default service customers. They still want to be in the monopoly business of providing all the services instead of respecting the New Hampshire Constitution, which basically says full and fair competition is an inherent right of the people and should be protected against all sort of efforts to overdo that. And so, we've been trying to move away from a regulatory paradigm to a market-based paradigm, provide more customer choice, and we're still working away at that.
Earlier about efficiency in some of the electrical programs, and Don, you're excited about community power being part of New Hampshire's energy mix.
I couldn't be more excited about community power. First of all, I think we should acknowledge that you have a very distinguished guest in Clifton, who is the deputy mayor in the city of Lebanon. Before he was deputy mayor, he was a PUC commissioner. Before he was a PUC commissioner, he was a member of the New Hampshire Senate. Before he was a member of the New Hampshire Senate, he was a member of the New Hampshire House of Representatives. And way back then, he was the co-author of the Electric Industry Restructuring Act. So he literally is one of the fathers, I guess you could say, of electric industry restructuring. The downside of restructuring is that customers, including residential customers, have literally paid billions of dollars in stranded costs in order to create these changes in the electric industry, and yet there have essentially been no benefits for residential electric customers arising out of restructuring. In fact, there's data that suggests that residential customers who have migrated out to competitive suppliers have actually done worse than they would have if they had just stayed with the utilities default service. And it's been especially hard for low-income customers to prevail in the competitive market. So this community power initiative just demonstrates that there is power in numbers, right? You take all that residential demand in the city of Lebanon from all those residences, you pull them together, and you manage that demand, and you go out into the marketplace, and you save customers money. And in the process, especially if you're the city of Lebanon, you do it in a renewable and sustainable way, and you create a highly advanced and enlightened municipality at a time when our national government refuses to rise to these challenges. So you save people money, you save the environment, it's about local control. This is the coolest policy initiative I have seen, at least since I became consumer advocate back in 2016.
So, Clifton, some of the things, you're also involved with Community Power New Hampshire as an organization. And let me see if I got this right. They're developing a hub of experts such as yourself and many other people that are supportive of community power and have the professional skill sets to be able to share with communities that choose to pursue community aggregation.
Right, we're working with other communities, City of Nashua, Town of Hanover, Cheshire County, and some other smaller towns, along with Clean Energy New Hampshire, to form a new organization that we want to call Community Power New Hampshire. Right now, we've actually engaged lawyers to help us finalize the organizational documents, and we hope to get that going shortly. Part of the law allows municipalities and counties to work together in what's often called a joint action agreement or a joint action agency. It allows us to do some of this work jointly. And the idea with Community Power New Hampshire is to have an organization that can provide support services that's democratically controlled. So a lot of this is about democratizing energy policy, if you will, and making it more locally accountable. But Community Power New Hampshire would help communities organize and operate their community power programs according to their own sort of needs and policies. One community may make a priority on getting the lowest possible prices. Another community may say, well, we want some low prices, but we also want the option for customers to lock in on the long-term with more renewables. So you could design the programs according to what the local communities want and have an entity that has the expertise that is democratically governed, that's not sort of for profit. So you can get some of these value-added services to customers in an efficient way. And this is actually a model that's been well developed in California. Most of their CCAs operate on through joint power agreements. And it's also a very common model with the hundreds and hundreds of electric cooperatives and municipal electric utilities across the country. They typically have joint power agencies that work to help them procure their power supply, to manage it, to do risk management, portfolio management, and provide a whole variety of services that provide value to the customers. And so there are vendors out there who do this. A lot of the California CCAs have gone this route, and some of them, it's allowed them to achieve investment grade status, so they can use what's called revenue bonds to actually start directly financing some of their own local renewable projects using tax-exempt revenue bonds, which New Hampshire law already provided for. So we're sort of emulating the experience of what some other states have successfully done in this regard.
Yeah, I think the most important thing I take out of that is, like, if I wanted to promote a community power aggregation committee here in the city of Manchester, that would mean that I wouldn't have to get everybody that had the professional skill sets to make it possible. I could do it with a group of interested people and then be able to use the Community Power New Hampshire as the resource hub for those people that are experienced in those professions.
Exactly. And in addition, we hope that it can be an advocacy group in the regulatory process and, if necessary, in the legislative process on behalf of community power aggregations that want to be a part of this.
So we talked the other night, and we have Dawn here as well, and I think one of the concerns you expressed to me with a community the size of Manchester is there's some legislation that still needs to be worked on. And that legislation is on a default payment that all the stakeholders would share a percentage of that payment, as opposed to, I believe now it's, how does it work?
Well, this comes up when a customer doesn't make full payment and they're falling behind in their payments. And there are programs to help low-income customers with this, and so we want to see those continue. But there's other customers, including occasionally businesses, who just can't pay their whole bill, or they fall behind in their bills. So the way it works sort of now, there's a hierarchy of who gets paid. So if there's a payment plan that gets paid first, but then it kind of comes down if there's past due accounts, then the utility past due accounts get paid first, and only then is there money that goes towards the community power aggregation or competitive suppliers past due accounts. And then once all those are paid, then it goes to the utility provided charges, including the utility sponsored default energy service. And then only after that, if there's money left over, would it go to a community power aggregation or a competitive supplier.
Cliff, is that in the statute, that payment hierarchy, or is that just something?
No, that was adopted through adjudicated proceedings many years ago and written into the utility tariffs.
So the PUC could do the right thing and create a more, equitable set of payment priorities.
Right. We've suggested simply that because we call them CPAs, community power aggregations, under the law can become the alternative default service provider, that they be put in the same basket with the utility provided default service, so that if say somebody's current and they're just paying their current bill, but they only pay half the bill instead of all of it, and part of it, a third of it's owned to the community power aggregation and 2/3 to the utilities, well, you'd each get half of what you're owed. So you prorate it to the two accounts. So at least we're not at the very bottom of the payment structure. In which case, the utility which is doing the billing and collections, may have little motivation to try to collect at that point because they're not owed anything. Other states like Massachusetts that have these much more widespread community choice aggregations, they have what's called purchasing of receivables, where actually receivables that go past due get purchased by the incumbent utility, and they manage those past due accounts. And if there's, if they end up with bad debt within the regulatory constraints, some of that they can essentially charge in their rates that they charge to all customers. There's some pros and cons to purchasing of receivables. We thought at the very least we should change what's called the waterfall payments, who gets paid, so that we're on more on par with utility default service. And there was actually two bills introduced in the Senate this past session that had like 5 or 6 Republican sponsors and 5 or 6 Democratic sponsors. So it was very bipartisan. It was almost half the Senate that was sponsoring bills that would have changed this waterfall payment as we've suggested. But neither of those bills were passed by the Senate before the pandemic shutdown. And so they kind of just died in committee, if you will, because the House wouldn't take any new bills from the Senate after the deadline passed when everything was shut down. So we're hoping maybe through the rules process that the commission could straighten this out. Otherwise, we may have to go back to the legislature because there's just, particularly in light of the pandemic, there's a lot of uncertainty as to how much bad debt there might be. And CPAs would be disadvantaged relative to the utility, so it would not really be a level playing field. And they don't even want to share with us what those number of customers might be that are past due or how much might be past due. So at least we can make a risk assessment because ultimately, money doesn't come from anywhere. So if somebody never pays their bill and they move out of state or they go bankrupt and you can't collect it, essentially you have to make that up from other ratepayers. And so there needs to be some way to make this sort of fair and level the playing field.
So to me, there are two insights. One is the one that Cliff just said, which is at the end of the day, the only wallet in the room is the wallet of the ratepayer. And two, this is how the utilities get what they want out of the system. They're too smart to go to the legislature and kill bills that they know are good bills, good for the public. But then when the implementation process happens and you have to get the PUC to adopt the right rules, that's when the utilities, kill these things by 1,000 cuts. So it's important to be vigilant, and it's important not to let the utilities talk these things and game these things to death. So that's what I try to do.
Thank Dawn and Clifton for joining me. I look forward, the elections are November 3rd, and pretty much what's going to be submitted to the legislators got to be towards the midwinter here. So if it's going to be resubmitted, and that'll be the time period. So maybe after the elections settle down and we know who's there, we can do another show together to focus on these issues so that people throughout the state know and will support what we need to get done to make this work properly. So I thank you, gentlemen, and I thank you all at home for watching us. Take care, be well, be safe, and see you again soon.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.